a widow, a stranger with no past, and a cattle baron who would drain the earth itself to take what wasn't his. The Montana Territory, 1885, where the land doesn't care if you're grieving and your neighbors are already counting the days until you fail. This is the story of one woman who refused to become another man's footnote. If this story grabs you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this ride carries us. Now settle in. This one's going to take a while. The cattle found him first. That was the detail nobody talked about afterward. Not at the funeral, not over the cold plates of food that neighbors brought to the house. Not even in the weeks that followed when men in clean boots came to the ranch with their sympathetic eyes and their careful questions about what Evelyn Mercer intended to do with the property. Nobody mentioned that it was the cattle who found Daniel Mercer's body, because that image was too raw, too real, and too ugly to sit beside whatever version of grief people preferred to witness. But Evelyn knew. She had been the one who had to go out there. October 14th, 1885. The sky that morning was the color of pewter, low and flat and indifferent. The kind of sky that sits on a person's shoulders like something physical. The frost had come in overnight, harder than expected for mid-October, and the grass along the north pasture crackled under her boots as she crossed it. She'd heard the hand shouting from somewhere beyond the tree line, that particular pitch in a man's voice that means something has already gone wrong and cannot be unwronged. Daniel had gone out before dawn. That was nothing unusual. He'd done it for 11 years, every single morning, the way some men drink coffee and read the paper, except Daniel Mercer walked his land before the sun arrived because he believed the ranch spoke differently in the dark. You can hear what the land needs if you listen before it gets busy, he used to tell her. She'd thought it was romantic when they were young. Later, it just became true. He'd been checking the fence line along the north pasture when the stampede came. The herd had spooked in the dark. Nobody ever fully agreed on what triggered it. A coyote, or a break in the fence, or just the collective madness that can take hold of 500 head of cattle at 2 a.m. without explanation. They'd moved northeast, in the direction of the creek, and Daniel had been standing directly in that path. He was 41 years old. He had a scar on his left hand from a branding accident when he was 19. He sang off-key when he thought nobody was listening. He had told Evelyn, 3 days before he died, that he wanted to plant apple trees along the south fence come spring. She stood over what the cattle had left of him and made herself look. Because that was who she was. That had always been who she was. The weight of ownership. The reading of Daniel's will took place in the front parlor of the ranch house on a gray Tuesday morning, with the lawyer, a thin man named Alistair Pruitt, who had ridden out from Billings with mud on his coat and papers in a leather satchel, sitting in the chair that had always been Daniel's chair. Evelyn watched him sit in it without appearing to notice, and decided she didn't like him. There were no children. Daniel had 2 brothers, both of them in Ohio, both of them already making quiet sounds through letters about the difficulty of traveling so far, about the unpredictability of Montana winters, about how perhaps the sensible thing would be to discuss selling the property before the season turned. The will was clear. Everything went to Evelyn. Every acre, every head of cattle, every debt and every asset, the house and the barn and the broken hay press Daniel had been meaning to fix since June. All of it. That's straightforward enough, Pruitt said, setting the papers on his knee and looking at her with that expression men used when they wanted to seem kind without actually committing to anything. Of course, you'll want to consider your options carefully, Mrs. Mercer. A ranch this size requires considerable management, the hands, the contracts, the grazing arrangements. I know what the ranch requires, Evelyn said. I've been running half of it for 11 years. He adjusted his collar. Of course. I only mean that with the absence of, it might be prudent to speak with someone about. Thank you for writing out, Mr. Pruitt, she said, standing. I'll send for you if I need anything. He left with his leather satchel and his careful words, and she stood in the parlor alone for a long moment, looking at the chair he'd vacated. Then she went to the window and stared out at the north pasture and tried to understand how 11,000 acres could feel like a cage. The trouble begins before the frost melts. The first hired hand quit on a Thursday. He was a man named Fitch, 40-something, with a gray beard and a habit of spitting tobacco juice near the fence posts, and he'd worked the ranch for 4 years. He came to the back door with his hat in his hands, and told her he'd found work elsewhere, and she could see in the way he wouldn't meet her eyes that this was not about money or conditions. It was about the signature on the wage book. "You're quitting because of me," she said flatly. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Ma'am, it ain't. I just think it's fine, Fitch," she said. "Collect what's owed." 2 more men left by the end of the week. A fourth gave her 2 days' notice and spent those 2 days doing such a poor job on the fence repair that she had to redo it herself. The 5th man, a young hand named Percy, who she'd always thought was reasonably sensible, told her he was leaving for the winter and would consider returning in spring. By the 2nd week of November, she had 3 men left where she'd had 8, and roundup was 6 weeks away. She sat at the kitchen table with the ranch ledger open in front of her and a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, and she did the math several times, hoping the numbers would change. They didn't. She needed at least 5 men to make roundup work. She could run the basic operation with 3 if she pushed hard, but bringing the herd in, sorting the cattle, managing everything before the real winter weather arrived. She needed more hands, and she didn't have them, and every man in the county apparently had somewhere better to be. She put her hands flat on the table and breathed. She was not going to sell. She had decided that standing over Daniel's body in the north pasture, and she hadn't changed her mind since, and she wasn't going to change it now. The ranch was hers, and the cattle were hers, and the apple trees she was still going to plant in the spring were going to be hers too. She needed help, which meant she was going to have to take what she could get. The man with nothing but a horse. He came in on a Tuesday afternoon riding a dark bay mare that had the look of a horse that had covered a great deal of ground without much rest. He wasn't a large man, medium height, lean rather than big, wearing a coat that had seen too many seasons and carrying saddlebags that were clearly everything he owned in the world. He had a jaw that needed shaving and eyes that were very still and very watchful, the kind of eyes that don't stop moving even when the rest of the face is completely quiet. He stopped at the gate and waited. He didn't shout or wave or announce himself. He just sat there on his horse and waited, which was either extremely polite or extremely strange, and Evelyn, watching from the kitchen window, hadn't yet decided which. She went out to meet him. "I heard you might be needing hands," he said. His voice was low and even, with something southwestern in it, though she couldn't have said exactly where. "Who told you that?" "Couple of men in town." Something moved briefly in his expression, flat and humorless. Men who seemed real pleased about it. She looked at him carefully. He let her look without fidgeting or explaining himself, which was unusual. Most men either over-explained or got defensive. He just sat quietly on his horse and waited for her to make up her mind. "You have a name?" "Cole Hart." "Where you coming from, Cole Hart?" A pause that was about 1 beat too long. "Wyoming, most recent." "Most recent?" she repeated. "And before that?" "Before that's a longer answer than you need right now." He said it without any particular tone, not defensive, not evasive, just simply stating a fact about what information was and wasn't relevant. "I know cattle. I can break horses. I can fix fence, read weather, handle whatever needs handling. You need someone who can work? I can work." Evelyn Mercer had been reading men for 29 years, and she had spent the last 11 of those years running half a ranch in the Montana Territory, which sharpened that skill considerably. She looked at his hands, which were calloused in the right places. She looked at the mare, which was tired but well cared for, the coat clean despite the long ride, the hooves in good shape. A man who took care of his horse that way was telling you something. She still didn't trust him. But trust wasn't what she needed right now. "$1 a day, meals included," she said. "Bunkhouse is around back. Rules are simple. You work when I need you to work, you don't drink on the job, and you don't take anything that isn't yours. You break any of those, you're done." "That's fair," he said. "I didn't say it was fair," she told him. "I said that's what it is." He nodded, something that might have been the beginning of a smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Yes, ma'am." Go proving ground. The first test came sooner than she expected. There was a horse in the 3rd stall of the barn that nobody had been able to work with since August. A gray gelding, powerful and fast and absolutely out of his mind, who'd thrown the last 2 men who'd tried to handle him and bitten a 3rd. Daniel had planned to sell him, then put it off, then died before getting around to it. Now the horse stood in his stall and pinned his ears back and screamed at anyone who came within 10 feet. The morning after Cole Hart arrived, Evelyn came out to the barn at sunrise and found him standing outside the Gray's stall with a rope loosely coiled in one hand, not moving, just standing there. The horse was in full panic display. Head up, whites of his eyes showing, stamping and snorting. But Cole was just standing there like he had absolutely nowhere else to be in the world. He stood there for 40 minutes. She watched from the barn door without saying anything. At the end of 40 minutes, the horse put his head down. Cole didn't reach for him right away. He gave it another 10 minutes, and then he took one step closer, and then he stopped again, and eventually, slowly, in increments that required more patience than Evelyn had ever personally possessed, the horse allowed him close enough to put a hand on his neck. The remaining 3 ranch hands were watching from the fence by then. "Hell," said the youngest of them, a kid named Ellis, who wasn't quite 20, under his breath. Later that week, Cole rebuilt a section of fence that had needed rebuilding since spring, correctly diagnosed a sick calf that the others had given up on, and organized the hay storage in a way that would cut losses by a third through the winter. He did all of this without being asked, without making a production of it, without appearing to care whether anyone noticed. But Evelyn noticed. She noticed everything. The problem with liking someone you don't trust. The difficulty with Cole Hart was that she couldn't find the edges of him. Most people you could find the edges. You talked to them long enough, worked beside them long enough, and eventually you understood where they began and ended, what they were afraid of, what they wanted, what they were hiding. With Cole, it was like pressing your hand against water. You could feel the surface, but nothing solid underneath. He wasn't unfriendly. He answered her questions directly. He showed up for work before anyone else was awake, and he was usually the last one done. He was quiet at meals without being sullen, and occasionally he said something dry and unexpected that made Ellis laugh out loud. He was, by every visible measure, exactly what he claimed to be, a man who knew how to work and was willing to do it. But the past was a wall he didn't open any doors in. She tried once, carefully, the second week. They were mending fence on the east property line in the late afternoon, the light going orange and the temperature dropping, and she said without looking up from the wire, "The men in town that told you I was hiring, were they the kind of men who thought it was funny, a woman running this place?" Cole was quiet for a moment. "Yeah." "What did you say to them?" Another pause. She could feel him deciding something. "I said I didn't see what was funny about it." She glanced at him. He was focused on the fencing, hands steady. "That's all?" "One of them thought it was a little funnier after," he said, and didn't elaborate. She wanted to ask him something else. She wanted to ask where he'd learned to be so careful with horses, and so easy with men, and so practiced at taking up the exact right amount of space and no more. She wanted to ask what he was running from, because he was clearly running from something, and she wanted to know if it was going to come riding up her property line one morning and create a problem she couldn't afford. Instead, she said, "Hand me that crimper." He handed it to her. They finished the fence. Something in the air. It was Ellis who mentioned it first. 3 weeks after Cole arrived, the kid came to find Evelyn at the barn with a look on his face like he wasn't sure he should be saying what he was about to say. She waited. "The creek's lower," he said. "Willow Run. I was checking the upper fence and I went by the crossing and it's—" He moved his hand to indicate a reduced level. "I know it's been dry, but it ain't right. It was low last week, too. I didn't say anything because I figured it was just the drought, but now it's really low." Evelyn set down the harness she'd been working on. Willow Run Creek ran along the western boundary of the ranch and then cut through the north pasture before heading downstream toward the valley floor. In a dry year, it ran shallow. In a very dry year, certain sections would slow to a trickle, but it had never, in all the years she'd known this land, approached anything like gone. "Show me," she said. They rode out together in the fading afternoon, and she stood on the bank of the creek where the crossing was, and looked at the water level, and then looked at Ellis, and then looked back at the water. It wasn't a drought. She'd seen drought. Drought made water retreat slowly, evenly, the whole creek dropping the same gradual amount from one end to the other. This was different. This was like something was pulling the water away, like someone had put their hand around the creek and was slowly squeezing. She became very still. "Don't say anything to the others yet," she said finally. "I need to think." She rode back to the ranch house in the dark. and she sat at the kitchen table with the cold coffee and the ledger and the numbers that still wouldn't change, and she listened to the wind come down off the mountains and push against the walls of the house, and she thought about what it meant when a creak started disappearing. She was still sitting there when Cole knocked on the kitchen door at 7 o'clock. He'd seen her ride in alone, he said. He'd seen her face. "What did you find?" he asked. Evelyn looked at him across the kitchen. This man she didn't know. This man she wasn't sure she trusted. This man who had showed up at her gate with a tired horse and no explanation and had quietly proved himself useful in a dozen ways that mattered. And she made a decision. "Sit down," she said. "I need to tell you something." And as the wind pushed at the house and the temperature outside dropped towards something serious, she told him about the creek, and she watched his face, and she waited to see what kind of man he actually was. She couldn't know, sitting there, that the answer to that question was going to determine whether her ranch survived the winter. She couldn't know that what Ellis had found at the crossing was not the beginning of a drought. It was the beginning of a war. Cole sat down at the kitchen table the way a man sits when he already suspects what he's about to hear isn't good. He didn't take off his hat right away, which told Evelyn he wasn't sure how long he was going to stay. He set his hands flat on the table and looked at her and waited. She told him everything Ellis had said. She told him about the crossing, about the water level, about the way it didn't look like drought. It looked like something else, something deliberate. She kept her voice even while she talked because she'd learned early in her marriage that if you let panic into your voice before you'd finished explaining the problem, men stopped listening to the problem and started managing your emotions, which wasted everyone's time. When she finished, Cole was quiet for a moment. He was staring at a point somewhere between them on the table, not looking at her, thinking. "Which direction does Willow Run come from?" he said. "Northwest, off the high ground above the Callaway land, then southwest along the Kane boundary before it cuts across the western edge of ours." He looked up at her then. Something had shifted in his expression, not alarm exactly, more like a door opening behind his eyes onto a room she hadn't known was there. "Kane," he said. Not a question. "Thaddeus Kane. He owns the 3 sections that border my western fence line. He's been—" She stopped, chose the next words carefully. "He's been present since Daniel died. In a quiet way. Men he knows coming by to ask if I've considered selling. His foreman happening to be in town every time I'm there. That kind of present." Cole nodded slowly. He was processing something. "You ever ride the Kane boundary, the section where the creek passes through his land before it gets to yours?" "Not in a while. I've had no reason to." "I'd like to ride it tomorrow," he said. "Early, before the light gets full." "Why before full light?" He looked at her steadily. "Because if someone built something they didn't want found, they probably built it somewhere they didn't expect anyone to look. And people look less carefully in the dark." Evelyn studied him. Outside, the wind had found a gap somewhere in the eaves and was making a low, persistent sound, the kind that settled into your bones after a while. "You've done this before," she said. "Looked for things people didn't want found." He didn't answer right away. When he did, it was measured. "I've been in situations where water was the problem." Yeah, that was all he gave her, and she understood that pressing would get her nothing useful. She stood and took her coffee cup to the counter and stood there with her back to him for a moment, looking out the dark window at the dark yard. "I'll ride with you," she said. "I figured you would." She turned around. He'd finally taken his hat off. It was sitting on the table in front of him, and he was turning it slightly in his hands, an unconscious movement, the first purely unguarded thing she'd ever seen him do. She filed that away. "Cole," she said. He looked up. "Whatever you did before you got here, whoever's looking for you, if anyone is, I need to know if it's going to land on my land." The hat stopped turning. He held her gaze for a long moment. "No one's looking for me," he said. "The things I'm carrying are mine alone. They won't bring trouble to your door." She didn't entirely believe him, but she believed he believed it, which was close enough for now. "Good night," she said. "Good night, Mrs. Mercer." She didn't tell him to call her Evelyn, not yet. They rode out the next morning before 4 o'clock, in the kind of dark that makes everything formless and close, the sky pressing down with no moon and no stars, and a cold that had teeth in it. Ellis had wanted to come, and she'd told him no, partly because she needed him at the ranch, and partly because she wasn't yet sure what they were going to find, and she didn't want a 19-year-old's reaction complicating whatever came next. Cole rode the bay mare. Evelyn rode her own horse, a reliable sorrel mare named Clara, who didn't spook at shadows and had excellent footing in the dark. They didn't talk much on the way out. There was a quality to Cole's silence when he was tracking something, focused and almost physical, like a pressure in the air around him, that Evelyn found herself not wanting to disturb. She simply rode beside him and paid attention to what she could see. They crossed the western fence line of the ranch and turned northwest, following the creek bed. The creek was running, but barely. A thin, dark thread that caught no light, winding between banks that showed clear watermark lines a foot above the current surface. A foot. That wasn't drought. Drought took water down by inches over weeks. This was something that had happened in days. Cole slowed his horse. He was looking at the ground, then at the hillside to the north, then at the creek again. He did this several times without speaking. Then he turned the mare uphill, and Evelyn followed without asking why, pushing through scrub brush and over rocky ground that climbed sharply into the darkness. It took 20 minutes of climbing before he stopped. "There," he said quietly. Evelyn came up beside him and looked. It wasn't large. That was the first thing. She'd expected something massive, something that announced itself. Instead, it was almost modest. A timber and earthen dam, perhaps 8 feet across and 4 feet high, built across a narrow gulch that she recognized, after a moment's orientation, as a side channel of willow run that she'd never paid close attention to. The dam was new. The timber was pale and clean, not yet weathered, the earthwork fresh enough that she could smell the turned soil even in the cold. And behind it, held back and redirected, was Willow Run Creek, diverted north and east toward Kane's land, through a channel that hadn't existed a month ago. She sat on her horse and looked at it and felt a kind of cold that had nothing to do with the November air. "He built it on this side of his line," she said. Her voice came out lower than she intended. "That's our land." "Yeah." "He built it on our land." "He did." Cole's voice was flat and careful. She became aware that her hands were tight on the reins. She made herself loosen them. "How long has this been here?" "Maybe 3 weeks? 4 at most. The earth hasn't compacted yet." 3 weeks. While she'd been wrestling with the ledger and the missing hands and the 1,000 small crises of a ranch without its owner, someone had ridden onto her property in the dark and built a dam and started stealing her water, and she hadn't known. She hadn't known because she'd had too many other problems to pay attention to the creek. "I want to tear it down," she said. "I know. Right now, I want to... Evelyn." It was the first time he'd used her name. She looked at him. He was watching her with an expression that was not patronizing and not soft. It was just direct. The way a man looks at you when he's being honest about something you don't want to hear. "If we tear it down tonight, he builds it again in a week. Or he builds it somewhere we can't find as easily, or he comes at this from another direction entirely. Tearing it down is satisfying, and it doesn't solve the problem." She held his gaze. The cold was really something now, her breath coming out in visible puffs. "Then what does?" "We document it first," he said. "We remember exactly where it is, what it looks like, how it's built, whose land it's sitting on, and then we decide how to move." She looked back at the dam. In the slowly improving light, the sky was shifting from black to something approaching dark gray. She could see it more clearly now. The construction was careful, deliberate. This wasn't built by someone in a hurry. This was built by someone who expected it to last. "He's been planning this for a while," she said. "Longer than the dam," Cole said. "The dam is just the part you can see." They stayed another 20 minutes, Cole walking the site with quiet, methodical attention, noting the angle of the diversion channel, the volume of water being redirected, the trail of fresh horse tracks leading northeast toward Kane's property line. He didn't write anything down. He was memorizing it, she realized. All of it. On the ride back, she asked him what he was thinking. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "I'm thinking Kane isn't stupid. A man who builds an illegal dam on someone else's land isn't doing it because he thinks he can get away with it forever. He's doing it because he thinks by the time it's discovered, the damage will already be done. Your cattle will be struggling, your losses will be visible, and then someone will come to you with an offer and it'll look reasonable compared to losing everything." Evelyn thought about Kane's men in town, the foreman, the polite letters from Daniel's brothers in Ohio, the hired hands who'd quit. He's been working this from multiple directions, she said. That's my guess. For how long? Cole looked at her. How long ago did Daniel die? The question landed badly, not because it was cruel. It wasn't. It was just direct. But because the answer told her something she didn't want to know. She turned it over and said very quietly, "You think he started before Daniel?" Cole didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. She rode the rest of the way back in silence, working through it. The dam, the hands quitting, the careful social presence of Kane's people, none of it was improvised. It was a plan, patient and layered, built by a man with enough money and enough time to wait for exactly the right moment. Daniel's death hadn't started this. Daniel's death had just removed the last obstacle between Kane's plan and its execution. She was the obstacle now, and Kane had apparently decided that an obstacle in the shape of a grieving widow was the easiest kind to move. She had never in her life wanted to prove someone wrong more than she did at that moment. They reached the barn as the dawn came in properly, pale and cold and thin, the light doing nothing useful for warmth. Ellis was already up, moving around the yard with the tense energy of a young man who knew something was happening and hadn't been told what. He looked at them both when they rode in, then looked at Evelyn's face and seemed to decide not to ask. Smart kid, she thought. She put Clara up herself, which she always did, and stood in the stall for a moment with her hand on the horse's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of her. There was a quality to animals when everything else was unstable. Their warmth was just warmth, not conditional on anything, not waiting to see how things played out. Cole was outside the stall when she came out. "There's something you should know," he said. She stopped. "What?" "This kind of thing. Water rights, land rights, creek diversions. There are legal frameworks for it in the territory. Kane knows those frameworks. He's probably already thinking about how to use them." "Meaning what?" Cole set his shoulder against the barn wall and crossed his arms. Not defensive, just thinking. Meaning tearing down the dam is one thing, but a man with Kane's resources doesn't rely on one approach. He's got lawyers who know the territorial land codes. If he's diverted your water, there's a chance he's also looking for a way to make that diversion legal after the fact. File a claim. Adjust some records. Make it look like the water was always his to redirect. Evelyn stared at him. "Can he do that?" "I don't know yet, but it's the kind of thing I'd be looking at if I were him." "And if he files a legal claim?" "Then the fight moves from your property line to a land office, and that's a different kind of fight." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Do you know anything about territorial land law?" The question hung there. Cole looked at her for a beat, and in that beat she saw something complex move through his expression, something that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite reluctance, more like a decision being made. "Some," he said. She waited. "More than some," he admitted. She had approximately 40 more questions about that answer, and she asked none of them. "All right," she said instead. "Then we need to talk about what we're going to do." They sat at the kitchen table again. It was becoming the place where the real conversations happened, with coffee that was actually hot this time and the ranch ledger open beside them, though they weren't looking at it. Cole laid out what he knew about territorial water rights in straightforward language. No performance to it, the kind of explanation that comes from someone who actually understands a thing rather than someone who wants to appear to understand it. The laws were complicated, and deliberately so. Water rights in the Montana Territory were a patchwork of precedent, prior appropriation doctrine, and recorded claims that overlapped and contradicted each other in ways that a skilled lawyer could exploit endlessly. The key question, Cole said, is prior use. Who's been using the creek longer? If we can establish that the Mercer Ranch has been drawing from Willow Run for longer than Kane has, that prior use creates a legal basis for your claim. "We've been using that creek for 15 years, Evelyn said. "Do you have records? Anything written?" She thought about it. Daniel's journals, he wrote everything down. Water levels, grazing rotations, which pastures used the creek at what times of year. He did it every season. Cole was still. "Where are the journals?" "In his study. I haven't—" She stopped. She hadn't been in Daniel's study since the week after the funeral. She'd closed the door and not opened it again because it still smelled like him. "I can get them." He nodded. He didn't push. There's something else, she said. If Kane decides to move on this legally, how long do we have? Cole thought about it carefully, the way he thought about everything. Not performatively, not to seem measured, just because that's how his mind worked. Depends on when he files, but these things move slow. A few weeks, maybe a month before anything becomes official. The question is whether we use that time to prepare a defense or to take the fight somewhere else. What does taking the fight somewhere else look like? His jaw moved slightly. He was choosing words. It looks like confronting the dam, directly, making Kane aware that you know what he's done and that you're not going to absorb it quietly and wait. A confrontation. Not a violent one, he said, and he said it in a tone that made her think this wasn't the first time he'd made that particular distinction. Kane wants you to do something violent or irrational. It would justify him and undermine you. The confrontation I'm thinking about is the kind where we make it clear, plainly and calmly, that we've found the dam and we know who built it, and we let him understand that we're not going away. And what does that accomplish? It buys time. It tells Kane you're not the easy obstacle he thought you were, and it might push him into moving faster than he should, which is when people make mistakes. Evelyn sat with that for a moment. The morning light was getting stronger outside the window, the kind of thin winter light that was beautiful in a cheerless way. She could hear Ellis outside doing morning chores, the comfortable sounds of a working ranch morning, ordinary and temporary all at once. When? She said. Tomorrow, before he has a chance to wonder whether you found it. She nodded. She picked up her coffee, and then she set it down again without drinking it, because the thought was already forming that tomorrow she was going to ride to the boundary of Kane's property and put herself in front of his men and make a statement she absolutely could not back down from, and that was not a decision she wanted to take lightly. "Cole," she said. He looked at her. "When we get there, to Kane's line, I need you to let me speak first." Something in his face shifted. He looked like he wanted to argue and then decided not to. "All right," he said. "I mean it. Whatever they say to me, whatever they do, let me speak first. I heard you. I need you to hear me and agree." He held her gaze. "I agree," he said. "You speak first." She nodded once, and that was that. They rode out the next morning with two of the other hands. Not Ellis, whose youth would read as weakness, but a quiet older man named Garrett, who was solid and unshakable, and another man named Rouse, who was large and calm and had spent 20 years doing this kind of work. 4 people total. Not enough to fight, and she wasn't going there to fight. They found Kane's men at the dam site, which was either bad luck or meant they were expected. 3 of them, positioned in ways that weren't accidental. The leader was a man named Dills, Kane's foreman, who had the kind of face that had stopped being readable sometime in his 30s and never recovered. He watched them ride up without changing expression. Evelyn stopped Clara 10 feet from him and looked at him steadily. "Mr. Dills," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. "I need you to tell Mr. Kane that we've found the dam. I need you to tell him it's sitting on Mercer land, which makes it an unlawful structure, and that we're documenting its existence as of this morning. And I need you to tell him that it will need to come down." Dills looked at her. He looked at Cole. He looked at Garrett and Rouse. His expression didn't change by any visible measurement. "Ma'am," he said, with the particular brand of courtesy that is designed to belittle without providing grounds for complaint. "I don't know what you think you found, but I know exactly what I've found," she said quietly. "And so do you. So does Mr. Kane. I'm not here to argue about it. I'm here to deliver a message." Silence. One of Dills's men shifted his horse. Nobody reached for anything. "You've delivered it," Dills said finally. "Good," Evelyn said. "Then we're done here." She turned Clara and rode back the way she'd come, without hurrying, without looking back. She could feel the space between her shoulder blades the entire ride. The particular awareness of being watched by men who had just been told something they didn't want to hear. Behind her she heard Cole and the others fall in, hooves on the rocky ground, steady and unhurried. Nobody spoke until they were a quarter-mile away. Then Garrett, who had been ranching in the territory since before Evelyn was born, said quietly to no one in particular, "Well, that's done." "It is," Evelyn said. Cole said nothing, but when she glanced at him, something in his face told her he thought it had gone the right way. Coming from a man who said almost nothing about almost everything, she took that as what it was. They were 2 miles from the ranch when she let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She was not naive enough to think this was over. Dills would go back to Kane, and Kane would make his next move, and whatever that move was, it was going to be harder and more formal and more dangerous than a timber dam on a hillside. Cole had said as much. The dam was just the part you could see. She rode home through the cold autumn afternoon with the creek running thin below the tree line and the mountains blue and vast and completely indifferent behind her, and she understood with a clarity that she wished she'd had 2 months earlier that what was coming wasn't a conversation or a negotiation or a legal technicality. What was coming was a fight for everything, and she was going to have to be ready. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, 8 days after they'd ridden to the dam site. Evelyn was in the barn working on a broken harness buckle when Ellis came in holding it at arm's length like it might bite him. It had been delivered by a man on a good horse who hadn't introduced himself, who'd handed it to Ellis at the gate and turned around and left without waiting for a response. The envelope was heavy stock, the kind that cost money, and her name was written on the outside in careful, precise script. She set down the harness and took it from Ellis and looked at it for a moment without opening it. She already knew, in the way you sometimes know things before you know them, that whatever was inside was going to change the shape of the next several weeks. She opened it. It was not from Kane directly. It was from a law firm in Billings, a firm called Aldrich and Morse, and it was written in the particular language that lawyers use when they want to be simultaneously threatening and completely deniable. Stripped of its careful phrasing, it said this: Thaddeus Kane had filed a claim with the Territorial Land Office, establishing legal rights to the waters of Willow Run Creek above the Mercer boundary line, citing prior appropriation and continuous beneficial use. The claim, once certified, would entitle him to redirect the creek's flow as he saw fit. Evelyn had 30 days to contest the claim before it became permanent. 30 days. She read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and put it in her coat pocket and went back to the harness buckle and finished fixing it, because the cattle still needed feeding regardless of what was in anyone's coat pocket. Cole was in the north pasture when she found him, checking on a section of fence that the early freeze had heaved out of true. He was on his knees in the cold ground, working at a post with a level and a tamping bar, and he looked up when he heard her horse and read her face immediately. She handed him the letter without a word. He read it standing up, his breath coming out in slow, cold puffs. When he finished, he read it again. Then he folded it and handed it back. Prior appropriation, she said. He's claiming he used the creek before we did. He's claiming it, Cole said. That doesn't mean he can prove it. Can he? Cole turned and put the level back against the fence post, checking it, though she suspected he wasn't seeing the reading. He's got lawyers who know how to read territorial records. He's probably found something, a grazing permit, a filing, something that technically predates Daniel's formal claim. It might be thin, but it doesn't have to be airtight. It just has to be enough to hold up if no one challenges it properly. And if no one challenges it properly, in 30 days, the water's legally his, yes. Evelyn looked out across the north pasture. The cattle were moving slowly in the cold, breath rising off the herd in a collective cloud. Willow Run was still running thin along the western edge, visible from here as a pale line between the frozen banks. Even now, with the dam in place, the creek was what kept this part of the ranch viable. Without it, the north pasture became useless by spring, and without the north pasture, she'd be selling off a third of the herd just to keep the rest alive. She understood, standing there, what Kane had actually built. Not a dam. A clock. The dam was just the mechanism that made the clock run. 30 days. What do we do? She said. It wasn't quite a question. Cole was quiet long enough that she looked at him. He was staring at the fence post, but his eyes were somewhere else entirely. We can hire a lawyer, he said. Someone in Billings who knows the land codes. That's the obvious move. That costs money I don't have. I know. He paused. There's another way. Harder. It takes most of the 30 days and there's no guarantee at the end. Tell me. He turned to look at her. Prior appropriation works both ways. If we can demonstrate that Mercer Ranch has been continuously and beneficially using Willow Run for longer than Kane's claim, his filing falls apart. We don't need a lawyer to argue that. We need evidence. Sworn testimony from people who witnessed the use. Settlers, ranchers, anyone who's been in this valley long enough to remember. Witnesses, Evelyn said slowly, not just neighbors. Those are easy to dismiss as biased. I'm talking about people whose memory of this land goes back further than any piece of paper Kane can produce. Old-timers. People who settled this territory before the formal land office even existed. He paused again. And there are native families in this valley who've known these waterways for generations. Their testimony about historical water flow and usage, if a land office official is honest and the evidence is overwhelming, it carries weight. She stared at him. We'd have to write out to all of them. Yes. We'd have to convince them to give sworn statements. Yes. People who have every reason to stay out of a legal dispute between two ranchers. Yes, he said, and his voice didn't soften it or apologize for it. He just laid it out the way it was. She looked at the cattle again. She thought about the 30 days. She thought about Daniel's journals, still sitting in the closed study, full of 15 years of careful notes about water levels and seasons, and a creek that had always been there when the ranch needed it. When do we start? She said. Something moved in Cole's face that wasn't quite relief. As soon as we can pack. They left 2 days later, before dawn, with Garrett left in charge of the ranch and Ellis given detailed and very specific instructions that she repeated twice to make sure he'd absorbed them. She took the sorrel and Cole took the bay, and they rode northwest into a morning that was brutally cold and completely clear, the kind of cold that hurts in your lungs if you breathe too fast. The first stop was a man named August Fenner, a retired rancher who'd been in the territory since 1861 and now lived on a small piece of land north of the valley with 2 dogs and a vegetable garden and what appeared to be an extensive personal library. He was 73 years old and had hands like tree roots and a memory that was perfectly intact and thoroughly unimpressed by everything. He looked at them from his doorway when they arrived. He looked at Evelyn first, and then at Cole, and then back at Evelyn. "You're the Mercer widow," he said. "I am," she said. "I heard about Kane in your creek." She blinked. "How?" "Because I've been watching Kane operate for 15 years, and I make it my business to know." He stepped back from the door. "Come in. It's too cold to talk on the porch." His kitchen was warm and crowded with things. Books stacked on every surface, maps pinned to the walls, a collection of glass jars that seemed to contain samples of various soils. He made coffee without asking if they wanted it, and set it in front of them and sat down across the table. "August Fenner," Cole said, "you filed one of the original grazing permits in this valley in 1863. Fenner looked at him sharply. "You know that how?" "Because I looked up every filing in the territorial record from this district going back 22 years, Cole said. "Your permit listed the watershed boundaries. Willow Run Creek is described as a shared water source for the Central Valley ranches. By name." Fenner stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned to Evelyn. "Who is this man?" "He works for me," she said. "What did he used to do?" She opened her mouth and closed it again. "I did a lot of things," Cole said evenly. "Right now I'm trying to keep this ranch from losing its water." Fenner looked at him for another moment, the look of a man assessing something he hasn't categorized yet. Then he picked up his coffee. "Kane filed a prior appropriation claim," he said. It wasn't a question. "Of course he did. He's been laying the groundwork for that for 2 years. The dam was just to accelerate your situation." "Will you give a sworn statement?" Evelyn asked. "About the creek. About its use. About what you've witnessed in this valley." Fenner set down his coffee and laced his fingers together on the table. The silence lasted long enough that she could hear the fire in the stove ticking. "If I do that," he said, "Kane will make my life unpleasant." "Yes," she said. "He probably will. Probably." He looked at her. She didn't look away. She didn't soften it or promise him it would be all right, because she couldn't know that, and he'd see through it anyway. "The Mercer Ranch has pulled water from Willow Run since 1870, Fenner said finally. "I watched Daniel Mercer dig the first irrigation channel himself. I remember the summer because my eldest son helped him and came home with his hands torn to pieces." He unfolded his hands and stood. "I'll give you your statement." It took 3 days to reach the next witnesses, 2 of them, a pair of aging brothers named Calvert, who'd been running sheep in the high country since before the cattle ranches arrived, and who had watched Willow run for decades with the particular attention of men whose livelihood depended on water sources staying where they were. They were harder. They didn't trust easily, and they had no particular reason to risk Cain's attention for a widow they barely knew. The older brother, whose name was Martin, sat across from Evelyn at their kitchen table with his arms crossed and his face closed and said, "What makes you think Cain won't just wait us out? You get your ruling, he finds another angle. He's been at this a long time." "He has," Evelyn said, "and so has everyone he's pushed around in this valley. The difference is that everyone's been doing it alone." She paused. "I'm not asking you to fight Cain. I'm asking you to tell the truth about a creek you've watched for 30 years. What happens with that truth is up to the land office." Martin looked at his brother. His brother shrugged in a way that meant he'd already made up his mind and was waiting for Martin to get there. "Fine," Martin said. Not warmly, but fine. The hardest conversation came on the 8th day. They rode to the eastern edge of the valley, where a small community of Crow families had wintered for generations, longer than any homestead filing, longer than any territorial record. Cole had known they were there, had known before she mentioned the creek, she realized, which added to the long list of questions she had about his past that she wasn't going to ask right now. An elder named Thomas Runs Far met them at the edge of the encampment. He was perhaps 60, unhurried in his movements, and he looked at them with the particular expression of a man who has watched a great many white settlers come to him with requests and is deciding whether this one is worth the bother. Cole spoke to him directly. "We're not asking you to take sides in a dispute between ranchers," he said. "We're asking whether you'd be willing to tell the truth about this watershed, about how the water has moved through this valley, about what this creek has always been." Thomas Runs Far looked at Cole for a long time. "You know this land," he said finally. It was neither a question nor an accusation, more like an observation. "Some of it," Cole said, "more than some." A pause. "Who are you?" Cole's jaw worked slightly. "Someone who's trying to do the right thing by a piece of land that deserves it." Thomas Runs Far looked at Evelyn. "This is your ranch." "It is," she said. "Your husband died." "Yes." He nodded slowly, not as a response to her words, more as if he was completing a thought he'd begun before they arrived. "The creek you're talking about," he said. "My grandfather's grandfather knew it. It has always moved the same way. It has never in the memory of my family belonged to any single man." He paused. "I will speak that truth. I will not speak it for you or against Cain. I will speak it because it is true." "That's all we need," Evelyn said. Over the next 10 days, they collected 7 more sworn statements from a former territorial surveyor whose records predated Cain's claim by a decade, from a postmaster who'd been in the valley since the early 70s and had documented correspondence about the creek's flow, from 2 women who'd homesteaded independently and remembered Willow Run's course with the precision of people who'd needed to know exactly where their water was coming from. Not everyone said yes. 3 people turned them away entirely. One, not unpleasantly, one with visible guilt, and one with a hostility that told Evelyn that Cain's pressure had already reached further than she'd understood. A woman outside the town of Crestfall told them she couldn't risk it, that she had children and a lease arrangement with Cain's people, and she was sorry, she truly was. She closed the door, and Evelyn stood on the porch for a moment and didn't let herself feel the weight of it until they were back on the road. "She's not wrong," Cole said quietly, riding beside her. "I know," Evelyn said. "Fear isn't cowardice. Not always." She looked at him. He was watching the road ahead, his face in profile, something distant in his expression. "You sound like someone who's made that distinction before," she said. He didn't answer right away. Then, "I've been in places where speaking the truth cost people things they couldn't get back." A pause. "I didn't always handle it well." She let that sit. The road curved through a stand of bare-branched cottonwoods, the light gray and flat. The temperature had dropped again overnight, and the ground was iron-hard under the horses' hooves. "Cole," she said. He looked at her. "Why did you come here? To this valley? To my gate?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to deflect again. Instead, he said, "I was going somewhere else. I'd been going somewhere else for about 2 years, just moving, working where I could, trying to stay ahead of something I wasn't sure I could stay ahead of. He paused. I rode through Crestfall, and those men in the saloon were laughing about the Mercer widow and her empty bunkhouse, and I sat there listening to it, and I thought, he stopped. What? She said. I thought somebody should do something about that. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't eloquent. It was just a plain statement of how a decision got made, and she found it more honest than anything elaborate would have been. What were you staying ahead of? She asked. A long pause. The cottonwoods gave way to open pasture, and the wind came at them unobstructed from the northwest. I worked for a man like Cain once, Cole said, a long time ago. I didn't understand at first what he was. When I did understand, I tried to stop him. And I did it badly, and people got hurt. Not by me. He seemed to be choosing each word with care. But because of me. Because I waited too long and then moved too fast and didn't think about who was standing between me and what I was trying to do. Evelyn watched him. What happened to the man? He lost in the end, but it took longer than it should have. A pause. I spent a long time after that moving, trying to figure out if there was a better way to do it, if there was a version of stopping someone like that that didn't cost the people around them so much. She understood then, not completely, not all the details, but the shape of it. Cole Hart riding into her valley was not an accident. He'd been practicing something, carrying something, looking for a chance to get it right. They got back to the ranch on the 18th day with 13 sworn statements and a collection of historical records that Cole had tracked down in 2 different town archives, documents that established Willow Run Creek's course and usage with a continuity that went back further than any of Cain's paperwork. Garrett met them at the gate with a look on his face she didn't like. What happened? She said, before she'd even dismounted. Cain's men came by 2 days ago, just rode along the fence line. Didn't say anything, didn't do anything, just rode it slow. He paused. And Ellis heard in town that Cain's added a second lawyer from Billings, someone named Crawford. Apparently he's the one who handled the Pearson claim last year. Evelyn had heard about the Pearson claim, a homesteader east of the valley who'd had a water dispute with a neighboring operation. He'd lost, quickly and decisively, and had sold his land within 6 months. Crawford, Cole said beside her. He said it like he recognized the name. She looked at him. You know him? I know of him, Cole said carefully. He's good. He works with territorial records in ways that are technically legal and practically dishonest. He's very good at making long-standing use look like informal arrangement, like something that was tolerated rather than established. Evelyn dismounted. Her legs were stiff from the weeks of riding. Her back ached in a dull, persistent way that she'd stopped noticing during the days and started noticing again each evening. She handed Claire's reins to Ellis, who'd appeared from the barn, and she stood in the cold yard and looked at the ranch around her. The house, the barn, the pastures stretching out, the mountains beyond, the line where the creek ran pale and thin along the western boundary. She'd been running for weeks. She'd collected testimony and documents and traveled across frozen ground talking to strangers. She was exhausted in a way that sat below the muscles, in whatever part of a person holds the things they're carrying. She thought about the woman outside Crestfall, with her children and her fear and her door closing quietly. She thought about what Cole had said on the road, about waiting too long and moving too fast and people getting hurt. We have 13 statements, she said. We have Daniel's journals, 15 years of documented use. We have a surveyor's records from 1869 that established the creek's original course. We have the testimony of people whose knowledge of this land goes back further than any of Cain's documents. Ellis was watching her. Garrett was watching her. Cole was watching her. That has to be enough, she said. Because it's what we have. Cole looked at her steadily. It's enough, he said. If it's presented right, it's enough. She nodded. She was not certain he was right. She was not certain of very much in that moment, except that the sun was going down behind the mountains and the cattle needed seeing to, and she'd gotten this far by not stopping when stopping felt reasonable. Then we prepare, she said. Whatever Crawford brings, whatever Cain's lawyers argue, we show up with everything we have and we let the truth do what it's supposed to do. Nobody said anything. The wind moved through the yard carrying the smell of cold and coming snow. Somewhere above the western tree line, invisible behind the gray sky, the mountains stood the way they always had, completely unchanged by any of this, patient in the way that, Only very old things can be patient. The creek ran thin below them. The cattle breathed their slow clouds into the cold air. The ranch sat in the failing light and waited, the way it had always waited, for whatever came next. Inside Evelyn, something had settled. Not peace exactly, not confidence in any comfortable sense. More like the particular stillness that comes when a person has done everything they can do and has run out of preparation and is standing at the edge of something that is simply going to happen now, one way or the other. The hearing was 12 days away. The 12 days before the hearing were the longest of Evelyn's life, and she had lived through a grief that she'd thought at the time was the worst thing she'd ever have to survive. This was different. Grief was something that happened to you. This was something that required her to keep functioning, keep thinking, keep making decisions, while carrying the weight of everything that could go wrong. The cattle still needed feeding. The fences still needed checking. Ellis still needed direction, and Garrett still needed coordinating, and the ranch ledger still needed balancing against numbers that had not improved simply because she had other problems to attend to. She slept badly. Not dramatically badly. She wasn't lying awake staring at the ceiling. She fell asleep fine and woke at 3 in the morning with her mind already running at full speed, turning over the evidence, the testimony, Crawford's reputation, the particular language of Kane's filing. She'd lie there for an hour, sometimes 2, and then give up and get up and make coffee and sit at the kitchen table with Daniel's journals spread around her, reading his entries by lamplight. His handwriting was small and precise. He'd written every day, brief entries mostly. Weather, water levels, which cattle were where, what needed doing. Occasionally something personal would slip through, a note about a hard winter or a good spring, or something Evelyn had said that he'd apparently wanted to remember. She found one entry from their 3rd year on the ranch, 1877, that read simply, "E fixed the south gate herself today while I was down with the fever. She fixed it better than I would have. I should tell her that more often." She sat with that for a while. She hadn't known he'd written it. She didn't know if he'd ever gotten around to telling her. She closed the journal carefully and put it back in the stack and went to stand at the window and look at the dark yard. Cole found her there most mornings. He'd come in around 4:30, knock twice on the kitchen door frame, and she'd already have a second cup poured. They'd sit and go over the materials. He'd organized everything. The 13 sworn statements, the historical records, Daniel's journals with relevant entries flagged with strips of cloth, with a thoroughness that told her this was not the first time he'd prepared a legal case, even if he'd never formally been a lawyer. She asked him about it once, obliquely. "You know how to do this," she said. "Put a case together. You've done it before." He looked at the stack of documents in front of him. "I've been on the other side of it. I've seen how these things get dismantled. That's different from knowing how to build one, but it helps." "The other side," she said. "You mean you've seen cases like this go wrong for the people who deserve to win?" He was quiet a moment. "Yeah." She didn't push, but she filed it beside everything else she'd filed about Cole Hart, in the growing category she privately labeled things I will understand eventually. 3 days before the hearing, August Fenner rode to the ranch unannounced. He arrived mid-morning on a horse that was better than it looked, dismounted at the gate with the stiffness of a man who'd been riding longer than his joints preferred, and walked to the house with a leather satchel under his arm. Evelyn met him at the door. "I thought of something," he said without preamble. She brought him inside. Cole was at the kitchen table and Fenner looked at him and then set the satchel on the table and opened it. Inside were papers, old ones, the edges brown and the folds worn soft with age. "My original homestead correspondence," Fenner said, "from 1863 through 1871. Letters between me and the Territorial Land Office, letters between me and 2 other men who settled this valley the same year." He spread several on the table. Willow Run Creek is referenced by name in at least 20 of these, including one letter from the Assistant Territorial Commissioner himself, written in the summer of 1865, acknowledging the creek as a shared watershed resource for the Central Valley settlement. He tapped that letter with one finger. That commissioner's name is still on the territorial board. He's 81 years old and lives in Helena. Cole was very still. "He's still alive." "He is. His name is Victor Aldred. We correspond occasionally." Fenner looked at Evelyn. "I've taken the liberty of writing to him. He remembers the creek. He remembers the original settlement arrangement." A pause. "He's willing to send a signed statement to the land office if it's requested through official channels." Evelyn looked at the letter, at the territorial commissioner's name in faded ink, at Fenner's handwriting in the margins, notes he'd made over the years. "Why are you doing this?" she said. Fenner looked at her with an expression that was almost impatient. "Because Kane has been eating this valley for 15 years and nobody has stopped him, because it was always someone else's problem." He picked up his satchel. "This time it landed on someone who won't fold. I'd like to see what happens when that's the case." After he left, Cole sat looking at the letter for a long time. Then he said, "A statement from the original territorial commissioner changes the weight of this significantly." "I know," Evelyn said. "Crawford will try to dismiss it on procedural grounds. But if it's officially submitted, can we get it officially submitted in 3 days?" Cole thought about it. "I'd have to ride to the telegraph office in Crestfall today and send the request to Aldred directly. He'd need to get the statement notarized and transmitted by tomorrow morning at the latest." Evelyn nodded. "Go." He went. He rode to Crestfall and sent the telegraph and rode back, and they waited. And the next morning a response came through that Evelyn held in both hands in the telegraph office while the operator pretended not to watch her face. Victor Aldred remembered. He had already prepared a statement. It would be transmitted to the Billings Land Office by end of business that day. She thanked the operator and walked out into the cold street and stood there for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. A woman passing by gave her a curious look. She didn't care. The night before the hearing, she couldn't sleep at all. She was up before 3, dressed before 4, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp on and the documents stacked before her, and cold coffee going colder in her cup. She wasn't reviewing the evidence. She'd reviewed it enough. She was just sitting with the fear, which she'd gotten reasonably good at over the past weeks, not pushing it away, not talking herself out of it, just acknowledging it the way you acknowledge cold weather. It's there, it's real. You put on your coat and you go outside anyway. Cole knocked at 4:15. She called him in, and he stood in the kitchen doorway looking at her, and the cold coffee, and the untouched documents, and he didn't say anything about any of it. "Do you want breakfast?" she said. "I'll make it," he said, and went to the stove without being asked and made eggs and biscuits with the methodical quiet of someone who knew his way around a kitchen, which she'd noticed before and added to the list. He put a plate in front of her and sat down across from her and started eating his own, and she found, unexpectedly, that she was hungry after all. They ate without talking for a while. Outside the window, the sky was still completely dark. "Cole," she said. He looked up. "Whatever happens today—" She stopped. She wasn't sure how to finish the sentence without it sounding like either defeat or sentimentality, and she wanted it to be neither. "Whatever happens today, I need you to know that what you did for this ranch over the past 2 months, I couldn't have done any of it alone." He held her gaze. "You would have found a way," he said. "Maybe slower, maybe different, but you would have." "Maybe," she said, "but I didn't have to." Something moved in his face. He looked down at his plate and back up at her, and for the first time since he'd arrived at her gate on his tired bay mare, with his worn saddlebags and his careful eyes, she saw something genuinely unguarded in his expression, something that was not defensive or measured or held at a careful distance. He said, "I'm glad I stopped here." She nodded once. Then she picked up her fork and finished her eggs. The Territorial Land Office in Crestfall was a wooden building on the main street that had been built with a certain civic ambition that the intervening years had not quite fulfilled. It was 2 stories, modestly grand, with official seals on the door and floors that creaked significantly, and a hearing room on the 2nd floor that held perhaps 30 people, if those people were willing to be close together. By the time Evelyn and Cole arrived, with Garrett and Ellis behind them and the full documentation in a leather case Cole carried, there were already people in the street outside. Not a crowd, not exactly. This wasn't that kind of town. But more than you'd expect for a land office hearing on a December morning. August Fenner was there. The Calvert brothers. 2 of the other people who'd given testimony. A handful of ranchers and settlers she recognized from the valley. People who hadn't been directly involved but had apparently decided to show up anyway. Martin Calvert fell into step beside her as she went up the steps. "Figured we'd see how it came out," he said, as if it was perfectly unremarkable that he'd ridden 40 miles in December cold to stand in a hallway. She didn't trust herself to say anything to that, so she simply nodded. Thaddeus Kane was already in the hearing room. She'd seen him at a distance before, at the stockyards in Crestfall, at a cattle auction 2 years back, but never this close. He was a big man, heavier than he'd been in his 50s, with white hair and the particular bearing of someone who'd been the most important person in every room he'd entered for so long that he'd stopped noticing he was doing it. He was dressed well, better than the room required, and beside him sat two men in clean suits who were clearly Aldrich and the other lawyer, Crawford, who was younger than she'd expected, mid-30s, with a precise look about him, the kind of man who kept his papers in perfect order and found disorder in others a personal offense. Kane looked at her when she came in. His expression was completely neutral, professionally so, the kind of neutral that is itself a statement. She sat down across from him and arranged her hands in her lap and looked at the hearing officer, a territorial official named Porter, who had the look of a man who'd rather be almost anywhere else and had accepted long ago that this was his life. Crawford opened for Kane's side with the kind of confidence that came from having done this many times successfully. His argument was structured and clean. Kane had filed a prior appropriation claim based on documented water usage predating the Mercer homestead. The claim was legally sound under territorial doctrine. The existing dam structure was a reasonable exercise of his established water rights, and any historical use by the Mercer Ranch had been informally tolerated rather than legally established. He was good. Evelyn had expected him to be good, and he was, and she sat and listened and kept her face arranged in something neutral while he laid out a version of reality that was technically constructed enough to be dangerous. Then Porter looked at Cole. Cole stood up without notes. He had the documents in front of him, but he didn't look at them, which she noticed and suspected Porter noticed too. He spoke in the same even, unhurried voice he used for everything, and he began not with legal arguments but with a question. "Mr. Porter," he said, "before I present our evidence, I'd like to ask whether the statement from former Territorial Commissioner Victor Aldred has been received by this office." Porter shuffled papers. "It has," he said. "Received yesterday afternoon." Crawford straightened almost imperceptibly. That had surprised him. "Thank you," Cole said. He began to lay out the case the way he'd organized it over weeks of preparation. Not dramatically, not with flourishes, but systematically and in plain language. He established the timeline first, working backward from Daniel Mercer's earliest recorded usage in 1870 through the testimonies collected from settlers who predated even that, to Fenner's original homestead correspondence, to Aldred's statement acknowledging the creek's status as a shared watershed resource in 1865. He presented each piece of evidence in order, connected each to the next, and spoke about what they collectively demonstrated with the calm certainty of a man who had lived with these documents long enough to understand exactly what they proved. When he reached the sworn testimonies, he presented each one briefly but fully. Fenners, the Calvert brothers, the surveyors, the two homesteading women, and Thomas Run's Fars, which he presented last, with a particular care, placing it not as a curiosity or as something exotic, but as exactly what it was. The testimony of people whose relationship with this land and this watershed went back further than any territorial filing, and whose account of Willow Run's natural course and historical usage was therefore the most authoritative record in the room. Crawford objected to its admissibility twice. Porter considered both times and overruled both times, though not quickly. He was a careful man, Porter, careful enough to be genuinely thinking about it rather than performing thoughtfulness. Then Cole placed Aldred's statement on Porter's desk. The former commissioner's statement establishes, Cole said, that as of 1865, the Territorial Land Office itself recognized Willow Run Creek as a shared watershed resource for the Central Valley settlement. That recognition predates Mr. Kane's prior appropriation claim by a minimum of 14 years. Under the doctrine of prior appropriation, the relevant question is not who filed first, it's who used first and who is recognized as using first by the territorial authority itself. He paused. That recognition belongs to the valley's original settlers, including the Mercer Ranch. The room was very quiet. Crawford was on his feet with a counter-argument about the technical limitations of the commissioner's 1865 correspondence, about how a general acknowledgement did not constitute a specific water right, about established precedent in territorial law. He was still good. He was still precise and structured. But Evelyn could see something around the edges of his performance that hadn't been there at the beginning. A slightly increased speed, a faint quality of managing rather than advancing, the professional equivalent of a man walking faster because the ground behind him had become unstable. Kane himself said nothing throughout. He sat with his hands flat on the table in front of him, and he watched Cole present the evidence, and he listened to Crawford's counter-arguments, and his face stayed professionally neutral. But once, his eyes moved to the stack of sworn testimonies on Porter's desk, and she saw something in them that wasn't neutrality. He hadn't expected 13 statements. He hadn't expected Aldred. Porter called a recess at 11 o'clock. 45 minutes, during which people spilled out into the hallway and down the stairs, and Evelyn stood at the window at the end of the second-floor corridor and looked out at the street below and tried to manage the feeling in her chest, which was somewhere between hope and the fear of hope. Cole came to stand beside her. He was carrying the empty leather case now, all the documents having been submitted. "How did we do?" she said. She kept her voice low. "We did everything we could do," he said. "Porter's honest. I watched him reading Aldred's statement during Crawford's rebuttal. He read it twice. That matters? It means he was taking it seriously, not looking for a reason to set it aside." He paused. "Crawford knows they're in trouble. He'll try for a procedural delay in the next session." She looked at him. "Can they get one?" "They can ask. Porter can grant or deny." He said it without false comfort, just the plain fact of it. She appreciated that. She'd come to depend on the plain fact of things from him. Fenner appeared in the hallway behind them. He had his hat in his hands, and he looked tired and composed in equal measure. "Porter read Aldred's statement," Fenner said quietly. "I know," Cole said. "Victor Aldred is not a name you dismiss," Fenner said. "Not in this territory, not yet." He looked at Evelyn. "You should be prepared for this to go either way. Porter's fair, but Crawford is good, and Kane's got money behind every argument." "I'm prepared for it to go either way," Evelyn said. Fenner looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once and went back down the hallway. The second session began at 12. Crawford did ask for a procedural delay, citing insufficient time to respond to the submitted documentary evidence. Porter denied it in 4 words. The evidence was available. Crawford accepted this with the composure of a man who'd expected the answer and asked anyway because that's what you did. Then Porter read his ruling. He read it in the measured, deliberate voice of someone who had written it carefully and was now delivering it the same way. He went through the evidence systematically, addressing each major piece: the historical records, the sworn testimonies, Crawford's objections to specific items, his reasons for overruling those objections. He spoke about prior appropriation doctrine and what it required and what the submitted evidence demonstrated. He spoke about Aldred's statement with particular specificity, acknowledging its significance. And then he said that the preponderance of evidence demonstrated continuous, long-established, and territorially recognized use of Willow Run Creek by the Central Valley settlements, including the Mercer Ranch, predating Kane's claim by a minimum of a decade. That Kane's claim, while procedurally filed, was not supported by the historical record when that record was presented fully. That the claim was therefore denied. That the dam structure on Mercer land was an unlawful encroachment and would need to be removed within 15 days. The room was quiet for a moment. Then several things happened at once. August Fenner let out a breath that he'd apparently been holding for the entire second session. Martin Calvert made a sound that was not quite a word. Ellis, who'd been standing against the back wall, put both hands over his face in a way that meant something different than it looked. Garrett simply nodded, once, slowly, the way old men nod when something they half expected has turned out to be true. Evelyn didn't move. She sat very still and looked at Porter's desk and heard the ruling echo in the room and felt nothing for a moment. Then something, but she couldn't name it. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't relief exactly. It was more like the sudden absence of a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped registering it as a separate thing from herself. Across the table, Kane stood. His face had not changed. He looked at Porter, then at the documents on the desk, then at Cole, and then, briefly, for just a moment, at Evelyn. His expression was not angry. It was not gracious. It was the face of a man recalibrating, which was somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. He turned and left without speaking. Crawford gathered his papers with professional efficiency and followed. Aldrich paused at the door and looked back at the room once, an unreadable look, and then was gone. Cole was beside her. She wasn't sure when he'd moved. It held he said quietly. It held, she said. She stood up. Her legs felt strange, slightly unreliable, as though her body had been running on a particular kind of tension for so long that it didn't immediately know how to recalibrate. She picked up her coat from the chair back and put it on, and she was doing the second button when she realized her hands were shaking. Not dramatically, just a fine, involuntary tremor, the kind that comes when the body releases something it's been holding. Cole noticed. He didn't say anything. He simply stood there, solid and quiet, until she'd finished the buttons. They walked out of the hearing room and down the stairs and into the December air, and the people who'd come to wait were still there, and several of them stepped forward, Fenner, the Calverts, Ellis breaking forward from the back. And the news moved through the small crowd with that particular quality of shared relief that can't be faked, the kind that comes from people who understood what was at stake and watched it go the right way against meaningful odds. August. Fenner shook her hand and then, unexpectedly, shook Cole's. Whatever you used to do, he said to Cole, I'd say you've done something useful with it today. Cole accepted this without elaborating, which was exactly what she'd have expected. Martin Calvert said nothing at all to her. He simply put his hat back on and looked at the land office building for a moment, as if committing something to memory, and then turned and walked to where his horse was tied. That, she thought, was the Calvert brothers' version of celebration. Ellis hugged her, briefly and embarrassingly, and then stepped back and turned red and looked at the ground. She let herself laugh at that. It felt strange in her throat, unpracticed, like a door opened in a room that hadn't been aired in a while. On the ride back to the ranch, they were mostly quiet. The afternoon was cold and clear, and the mountains in the west were picking up the low winter light in a way that made them look close enough to touch. The creek, where it ran beside the road, was still thin. The dam was still up until Kane's men came to take it down. But it was there, and it was going to stay there. And that fact settled into her gradually, like warmth coming back into cold hands. She was thinking about the apple trees, the ones Daniel had mentioned 3 days before he died. The south fence, he'd said. Come spring. She was going to plant them. She glanced at Cole, riding beside her on the bay. He was looking at the road ahead with that habitual watchfulness, the stillness that she'd stopped reading as distance and started reading somewhere along the past 2 months as just the particular quality of how he occupied space. He'd given her everything he had, and he'd never once made it about himself. That was rarer than the other things, rarer than the skills and the knowledge and the patience with difficult horses. Cole, she said. He looked at her. She almost said something about what came next, about the ranch and the spring and what it would require. She almost asked the question directly. Instead, she said, "Thank you." He held her gaze. Something moved through his expression, that same unguarded thing she'd seen at the kitchen table in the dark morning before the hearing. "Yeah," he said. They rode home through the long December light toward a ranch that was still standing, and a creek that would run when the thaw came, and a winter that was just beginning. Kane's men came to remove the dam 4 days after the ruling. Evelyn watched them from the hillside, not close enough to interfere, not far enough away to pretend she wasn't watching. There were 5 of them, Dills among them, working with the particular efficiency of men who've been given a task they find humiliating and want finished quickly. They didn't look up toward where she stood. She didn't expect them to. It took about 2 hours. When the last of the timber was pulled free, the water moved the way water always moves when something stops holding it back. Not dramatically, not in a rush, just steadily, and with complete indifference to the trouble that had been made over it. It found its old channel, and it followed it south and west, toward the Mercer boundary line the way it had always gone. She stood and watched until the water was running clear and full through the crossing where Ellis had first noticed it going wrong. And then she turned her horse and rode back to the ranch without saying anything to anyone about it. That evening, she went into Daniel's study for the first time since October. She'd been avoiding it for 2 months, and she knew why she'd been avoiding it, and she was done avoiding it now. She opened the door and stood in the doorway for a moment. The room smelled like him still, faintly. The particular combination of leather and wood and something she'd never been able to name that was just Daniel, just the smell of a person who had occupied a space for a long time. She went in and sat in his chair and looked at the desk. His pen was still there, the inkwell. A coffee cup he'd left that she'd never moved. An old survey map of the ranch pinned to the wall with the property lines marked in his handwriting, updated every few years as they'd made small adjustments. She looked at all of it for a while. She wasn't crying. She'd expected to cry, and she wasn't, which told her something about the difference between grief that's unfinished and grief that's just grief. The grief was still there. It was going to be there for a long time. But it had changed shape sometime in the past 2 months without her noticing, the way things change when you're too busy to watch them, from something that blocked the door to something that sat in the room with her and let her move around it. She picked up his pen and opened the ranch ledger to a new page and wrote the date at the top. Then she began to write, not accounts, not yet, but a record of what had happened. The dam, the testimonies, the hearing, the ruling. She wrote it all down in the same precise, practical way Daniel had always written things down, because the ranch needed to know its own history, and she was the one who had to keep it now. She was still writing when Cole knocked on the study door. He'd never come to this room before. He stood in the doorway with the same posture he'd had on her gate that first day, present without intruding, leaving the decision about whether to invite him in entirely to her. "Come in," she said. He came in and looked at the room the way he looked at everything, quietly and with attention. His eyes moved to the survey map on the wall, then to the journals stacked on the shelf, then to the pen in her hand. "Writing it down," he said. "Someone has to." He nodded. He looked at the survey map for a moment longer. "You're going to need to file the water rights formally. With the ruling, you have grounds to register continuous use. It should be on record so there's no question going forward." "I know," she said. "I'll go to Crestfall next week." He nodded again. There was a quality to his stillness in the room that was different from his usual stillness. Less settled. She noticed it the way you notice a change in weather before you can identify what's changed. She set down the pen. "You're thinking about leaving," she said. He didn't deny it. He looked at her steadily and said, "I figured the job was done." "It is done," she said. "The dam's gone, the ruling's in, the water's running." She paused. "Is that why you came in here? To tell me you're going?" "I came in here because the light was on and it's late." A pause. "And because I didn't know how to say it out at dinner with Ellis, sitting there looking at me like I'm about to shoot his dog." She almost smiled at that. Almost. "Ellis will survive." "Yeah." He was quiet a moment. "I don't want to be in the way of whatever comes next for you. You've got the ranch stable, you've got water, you've got 3 solid men, and the valley knows what you did and how you did it. You don't need—" He stopped. "What?" she said. "A man with no fixed address and a history he can't fully explain," he said flatly. She looked at him. He was meeting her gaze, but it was costing him something. She could see that. This was not a man who found it easy to be seen this directly. "Cole," she said, "sit down." He sat in the chair across the desk from her, the one where Daniel's brothers had sat in October talking about selling, and she thought briefly about that and then set it aside. "Here's what I know about you," she said. "You showed up at my gate with nothing, and you worked harder than anyone I've ever hired. You found the dam. You rode across frozen territory in December talking to strangers. You organized a legal case that a trained lawyer would have charged me more than this ranch is worth to build." She paused. "And you did all of it without once making it about yourself or what you were owed for it." He said nothing. "I also know you're carrying something you haven't told me about," she said. "And I know you used to work for someone like Kane, and something went wrong, and you've been trying to figure out how to do it right ever since." She looked at him evenly. "I'm not asking you to tell me the rest. I'm telling you what I already know." He was very still. "The ranch needs managing," she said. "Properly, long-term. Not hired hands who leave when a woman signs their wages. Not me trying to do 5 people's jobs at once. Someone who knows what they're doing and is willing to stay." She held his gaze. "I'm asking you to stay. Not as a hand. As a partner in running this place." The words sat between them. Partner. Not romantic, not yet. She wasn't going to pretend this moment was something it wasn't, but not nothing either. They were both adults who'd spent 2 months in close quarters, and both of them understood the weight of what she was saying. Cole looked at the survey map on the wall. He looked at Daniel's pen on the desk and the journals on the shelf and the ledger open in front of her. He looked at his own hands for a moment, I'm not easy to know, he said. I've noticed, she said. I make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. You make fewer than most. Evelyn. He said her name the way he always said it when he wanted her to hear something carefully. I'm serious. The things I've done, the places I've been, I told you no one was looking for me, and that's true. But the past doesn't disappear because you outdistance it. It just travels slower. She looked at him steadily. Are you telling me to say no? A long pause. Something moved through his face, the complexity she'd seen in glimpses over 2 months, all of it surfacing at once and then settling. No, he said quietly. Then stop arguing against yourself and tell me what you actually want. He let out a breath. It was the most unguarded sound she'd ever heard from him, that breath, the sound of a man releasing a position he'd been holding for a long time. I want to stay, he said. Good, she said. Then that's settled. She picked up the pen and went back to the ledger. Cole sat across from her for a moment, and then he stood and went to the survey map on the wall and stood looking at it with his hands in his pockets. And she wrote, and the fire in the small iron stove in the corner ticked steadily against the cold. And that was how they spent the rest of that evening, in the same room, each doing something useful, not needing to fill the quiet with anything. It was the most at home she'd felt in 2 months. Winter came in hard the following week, the first real snow arriving on a Wednesday night, and not stopping until Friday morning. The ranch went into its cold weather rhythm, the particular contraction of activity that happens when the temperature drops below useful and everything becomes about maintenance and survival. Feed the cattle. Check the water sources. Keep the barn dry. Wait. Cole was good at winter. She hadn't known that about him yet, and she learned it, that he was the kind of person who found the pace of a hard winter workable, who could spend a day doing the slow, repetitive work of cold weather ranching without becoming restless or difficult. He fixed things that had been broken since spring. He organized the hay storage in ways that would cut waste significantly. He spent 2 afternoons teaching Ellis things about horse care that the kid wrote down in a small notebook, which Evelyn found touching and didn't mention. There were evenings where she and Cole sat in the kitchen after dinner and talked. Not about the ranch always, sometimes about other things. Books, of which he'd read more than she'd expected, the way certain landscapes looked in certain lights, the particular stupidity of specific decisions they'd each made in their younger years, which they shared carefully, each testing how much truth the other could sit with. He told her more, in pieces, over those evenings. Not everything. She didn't think she'd ever have everything, and she'd made a private accommodation with that. But more. He'd trained as a lawyer, briefly, before the frontier made that seem irrelevant. He'd worked for a cattle operation in Colorado, a man named Greer, who turned out to be running land schemes that displaced smaller homesteaders. Cole had tried to intervene from the inside, had gathered evidence, had gone to a territorial official, and the official had been in Greer's pocket, and several families had lost their land anyway, while the legal process ground on, and Cole had carried that forward ever since like a stone in his boot. You didn't fail them, Evelyn said one evening when he'd gotten to that part. I didn't succeed, he said. Those aren't the same thing. The system failed them. You tried. Trying doesn't keep a family on their land. No, she said, but you tried differently this time. You thought about who was standing in the middle before you moved. You built something instead of just fighting something. She paused. I noticed that. He was quiet for a moment. You notice a lot of things. I always have, she said. Daniel used to say I noticed things faster than was comfortable for people around me. Cole smiled at that. A real one, not the edge of something that passed across his face sometimes. He wasn't wrong. It was the first time she'd made a joke about Daniel, and it had come out naturally, which told her something. Grief didn't leave on a schedule. It stayed until something else grew large enough beside it to give you perspective on its size. She missed Daniel with a constancy that she suspected wasn't going to go away. She was also still alive, and the ranch was still standing, and it was December, and she was sitting in her kitchen with someone she trusted. And both those things were true at the same time, and she was learning how to hold them both. The letter from Kane arrived in January. It was short. 1 paragraph, on the same heavy stock as the legal notices, but this time in his own handwriting, not a lawyer's. She read it at the kitchen table and then read it again and then handed it to Cole without a word. He read it. His expression didn't change except in the small ways she'd learned to read. Kane wrote that he had reviewed the outcome of the hearing and had decided against pursuing further legal action. He acknowledged, briefly, without detail, in the way that proud men acknowledge things they can't quite bring themselves to fully state, that the evidence presented had been substantial. He made no apology. He made no concession of wrongdoing. But at the end, in a final sentence that read like it had cost him something to write, he said that a woman who could gather that kind of testimony from that many different people in the territory was not the kind of adversary worth continuing against. That was all. Cole set the letter down. "He's done," he said. "You think so?" That letter cost him more than another legal filing would have. He wouldn't have written it if he wasn't done. She picked it up again and looked at the last sentence. Not the kind of adversary worth continuing against. She turned it over in her mind, testing it for insincerity, for threat disguised as respect. She couldn't find any. It was what it was, a powerful man's reluctant acknowledgement that he'd miscalculated the obstacle in front of him. She folded the letter and put it in the back of the ranch ledger, behind the last page. Not because it was something to be proud of exactly, but because it was part of the record, and the record should be complete. She filed the formal water rights claim in Crestfall in late January, with Cole beside her at the land office counter, and the clerk, a different clerk than Porter, processing the paperwork with the complete indifference of someone who did this every day. When the registration was stamped and dated and handed back to her, she stood with it in her hands for a moment. It was not dramatic. It was a piece of paper with an official seal on it. But it meant Willow Run Creek was tied to the Mercer Ranch and the territorial record in a way that would survive weather and time and men with plans, and that was not nothing. They were married in February before the worst of the winter broke. She'd asked him, which she knew surprised him, though he recovered quickly. She'd asked him one morning over coffee, plainly and without preamble, the way she'd come to do things after 2 months of learning that he responded best to plain statements. "I think we should get married," she said. He looked at her across the table. "Yeah?" he said. "I think it's practical," she said, "and I think I want to, and I think you want to, and I don't see a reason to wait until spring when we're both already here." A pause. "That's a pretty short argument for a fairly significant decision," he said. "I could make a longer one if you need it." Something crossed his face. The real smile again, the one she'd been seeing more of lately. "No," he said. "Short one's fine." The ceremony was small. Fenner came, and the Calvert brothers, and Garrett and Ellis, and a woman named May Hutchins, who'd been a friend of Evelyn since the early years, and who cried at weddings with an enthusiasm she made no attempt to moderate. The justice of the peace read the necessary words in the front parlor of the ranch house, standing in front of the window that looked out over the north pasture, and outside the world was white and still and very cold. Cole said his part in a clear, steady voice. When he put the ring on her finger, his hand was not entirely steady, which she noticed and which she loved him for, because it told her that whatever composure he carried in the world, this was not something he'd found a way to be unmoved by. She hadn't found a way either. What she understood, standing in her own front parlor in February, was something she hadn't been able to articulate before and could now. That what she'd been doing since October wasn't simply surviving. It was deciding, over and over, who she was going to be inside the loss, whether she was going to let the grief and the fear and the weight of 11,000 acres compress her into a smaller version of herself, or whether she was going to stay full size and find out what she was capable of. She was capable of more than she'd known. She suspected that was true of most people, and that most people never found out, because the circumstances that reveal that kind of thing are brutal ones, and most of the time, that's a mercy. Spring came with the particular violence of Montana springs, fast and wet and muddy, the creek running full and quick with snowmelt, the pastures turning from brown to green in what felt like days. The cattle moved back to the north pasture. Ellis grew about an inch and started wearing his hat differently, which Garrett noted was the first sign of a man thinking himself more capable than he was, which was not necessarily a bad thing in a young person. Cole fixed the south fence line, the one that ran along the edge of where the apple trees were going to go, doing it properly this time, posts set deep enough to handle the heaved ground. Evelyn ordered the apple trees from a nursery in Billings. 12 of them, various varieties, arriving in April as small bundled rootstock that required planting in cold soil and a certain amount of faith in things you couldn't yet see. She and Cole planted them together on a Saturday morning in early April, working down the fence line, Ellis digging holes and Garrett carrying water, and the whole operation taking most of the day and leaving everyone's knees and backs appropriately complained about. When the last tree was in the ground, she stood and looked at the row of them. They were small. They looked like sticks with ambition more than anything resembling a future orchard. They were going to take years. She was fine with that. She'd learned something about years. Daniel would have planted them 3 feet further apart, Garrett said, looking at the row with his arms crossed. Daniel would have been right, she said, but these will manage. Garrett considered this and then nodded in the way that meant he agreed but wasn't going to say so out loud. Cole came to stand beside her. He was muddy to the elbows, and he'd managed to get soil on his face somehow, which she'd stopped finding remarkable about him in the months since winter. He looked at the trees, then at the fence line beyond, then at the north pasture where the cattle were moving in the early spring light. "Good day's work," he said. "It was," she said. She looked out across the ranch, the house, the barn, the pastures spreading into the afternoon light, the mountains beyond everything else, permanent and enormous and indifferent in the way that mountains are indifferent. And below the tree line, running along the western edge of the property, Willow Run Creek, full and clear and entirely where it was supposed to be. She thought about the woman she'd been in October, sitting at the kitchen table with cold coffee and a ledger that wouldn't balance and men who were quitting because she was the wrong kind of person to sign a paycheck. She thought about riding to the dam site in the dark. She thought about strangers who'd opened their doors in December cold. She thought about a land office hearing room and 13 sworn statements and a territorial commissioner who was 81 years old and still remembered a creek. None of it had been clean. None of it had been easy or certain or without cost. She'd been afraid through most of it, and she'd done it anyway, which she now understood was different from being brave. Brave was something you were. Doing things afraid was just something you did, one day after the next, because the alternative was letting the fear make your decisions for you. The apple trees were in the ground. The creek was running. The ranch was standing. The rest, she figured, was just the years ahead of her, and she had those. She looked at Cole beside her, muddy and quiet and exactly where he'd decided to be, and he looked back at her, and neither of them said anything, because some things didn't need saying to be completely understood. She turned back to the pasture. Around her the ranch moved in its perpetual way, cattle grazing, Ellis heading toward the barn, Garrett walking the fence line out of habit and professional stubbornness. The mountains stood where they'd always stood. The creek ran where it was supposed to run. Another season beginning, another year of work ahead. All of it uncertain, some of it hard, none of it guaranteed. She was ready for it.